How's it going? Welcome back to another installment of our study in covenants. And we're kind of coming into the thick of things now, right? We've looked kind of at the covenant of works and what that might be, and how that would work into the biblical narrative. And then last week we looked at the covenant of grant. And really what we talked about in that episode or in that installment was the notion that the covenant of grant protects the underling, maybe that's the wrong word, protects the person as opposed to the king, right? So the person is the one being protected in that covenant. Today, we're going to look at the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. Now, the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, I think, is very important on multiple levels, and we could get into all different ideas and concepts of the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. You can go online, you can look up what a Suzerain Vassal Treaty is, and you will find some very interesting things. You'll find maybe some documents that have been discovered. We have Suzerain Vassal Treaties that date all the way back to the 1400s. And this actually is very important for the dating of the biblical narrative. And the reason why is because it is believed by many scholars that the book of Deuteronomy follows a Suzerain Vassal Treaty. And so, first of all, let's look at what a Suzerain Vassal Treaty is. And man, I start talking about this stuff, my brain just explodes with all sorts of ideas and where I want to go with all this kind of stuff. And I need to kind of reel it back in and just try to be as, I need to break it down so that people can understand it too, because this is actually a really deep subject. It's a subject that, is extremely interesting to me, but I think it also explains a whole lot about our biblical text. As I tried to say in the last installment, I'm not necessarily saying that God modeled his covenants after a man-made covenant system. Rather, I think it's the other way around. I think that God implements his covenant system all the way in the beginning, before time exists. I think that his covenant system is in play, and then all of a sudden, as time progresses on, mankind starts to model their covenant system after the covenant system that God has already created. And so I don't think that we see a modeling of God's covenant after man-made covenants. It's the other way around. However, what's really interesting about the book of Deuteronomy is that it seems to be modeled, it seems to align exactly with the Suzerain Vassal Treaties of the 1400s BCE. So 1400s before Christ came, and this is important for dating, I believe, for dating the Exodus as well, particularly when we're talking about liberal scholarship and the want to date Deuteronomy in the 700s. This I don't think works at all, and I think that the work on Suzerain Vassal Treaties has shown that. Okay, so let's start by breaking down just a couple of words. The word suzerain, or the suzerain can also be referred to as the great king. And so when we think of the suzerain or the great king, that's what we're thinking about. We're thinking about somebody who is like the superior king, and then the vassal is maybe an under king, maybe an under shepherd, maybe an under people, maybe a nation, something like that. But that is the agreement that's going on here, a great king and a vassal. And basically, the way that we can think about this, we see Suzerain Vassal Treaties in the Tanakh, in like 1st and 2nd Samuel, the Chronicles, Kings, stuff like that. We actually see Suzerain Vassal Treaties being cut between peoples. Okay, so what is the nature of a Suzerain Vassal Treaty? Basically what happens, we'll set up a little scenario for you. A king, let's say the king of Israel goes and he conquers, let's just pretend for a few seconds, let's say he goes and he conquers Egypt, okay? And he wants to retain Egypt as his land, as part of his land. And but he also wants to go live back in Jerusalem. He doesn't want to live in Egypt and make sure that the people are doing what he wants them to do, that the land is still under his rule. In other words, he doesn't want the people just reclaiming the land and saying, this is our land, we're going to reclaim it again. And then he has to come and conquer it again. So what does he do? He cuts a covenant. He cuts a covenant with somebody there who is maybe a king or a governor or someone who can be looked up to by the people. Maybe he was a ruler. And the covenant that he makes is that you're going to rule the land for me, but you're still under my command. And so it's as if I'm ruling the land, but you're going to rule it for me. But you have to have complete allegiance to me. If you have complete allegiance to me, then I won't come back and overthrow the land. I won't come back and I won't come back and conquer you again or any of these things. In fact, I'll bless you. I'll bless you and I'll bless you and I'll bless you with all these different things. Here are the stipulations. I'm going to bless you with all this if you rule this land as if you were me. In other words, my name, my flag, all these things are on this land, and you get to rule it this way. Now, let's pause for a few seconds and talk about the theology of the Godhead. There has been something called agency. And if for those of you who have followed me and my ministry for a really long time, you probably remember my debate with Sean Griffin. And it wasn't actually a debate, it was just a conversation. But in the very beginning of that, I said, he started talking about agency. And I said, well, if we want to talk about the Suzerain Vassal Treaties, he said, I don't know what those are. And that basically meant that he had never actually studied agency. Because within the Bible and within biblical theology, there is something that is called agency. And agency can best be seen in a Suzerain Vassal Treaty. A Suzerain Vassal Treaty would be that, and let's take this into the realm of theology, where most people who believe in that Yeshua or Jesus is not divine, what they will say is, well, Jesus is the vassal of the great king, which is the Father, which is God. He is the vassal, or he is the vassal of the suzerain king. And there's even language that would support such an idea. So, for instance, God says to David, "Today you are my son; today I've begotten you." This is exact language that we find in Suzerain Vassal Treaties. So the argument would go something like this, and this is honestly why I brought Suzerain Vassal Treaties up in that conversation with Griffin, is because I thought that's where he was going to go, because anyone who studied agency would probably want to go there first and foremost. The idea would be, well, see, we have all this language of Christ being a vassal, and that God is the great king to this vassal, and so on and so forth, and therefore he was created, and you can see where all of this goes. The problem with this theology is that within Scripture you have multiple things going on, but Israel is seen as the vassal, and Yeshua or Jesus is seen as the great king overall. Now, there is language, admittedly, there is language that is attributed to Yeshua that would place him as the vassal. However, there is very good reason for this, and I think that this is a lot of what happens when it says that he came in servant form, that he didn't find, Paul tells us in Philippians, he didn't think his position with God something to be retained, but he emptied himself and came in the form of a servant, so on and so forth. Ultimately, the point here is simply this: when we look at the Godhead, Christ, Jesus, is not seen as the vassal in the larger scope of everything. He's actually seen as the great king. And Israel is seen as the vassal, not as not that Christ is the vassal, but that Israel is the vassal. And actually, Deuteronomy is a great example of how Israel is the vassal. Okay. That was a total rabbit hole, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to give you a couple of references before we go on. The first one is this book. I think you've already referenced it before. This is Meredith Kline. It's called Treaty of the Great King. I'm going to read from this in a little bit. Treaty of the Great King, The Covenant Structure of Deuteronomy, Studies and Commentaries. And then the other one is this book. This is an expensive book. I had to save my shekels for this one. The Gospel According to Moses by Daniel Block. If you haven't read this book, man, it is good. Block, I don't think you can go wrong with Block. I don't agree with every single thing he says, but boy, oh boy, he is a heavy hitter, and man, he is so much fun to read, and he has so much right. It's really quite astounding. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about suzerain vassal treaties. So let's talk real quick about how this works now in tandem with the covenant of grant. Remember that the Abrahamic covenant, we talked about how this was a covenant of grant. God promises Abraham that he's going to give him land. It's going to be dynastic, so it's going to go through the dynasty, right? Through Abraham's dynasty, the land will continually be his, right? And that he's going to bless him. And so these are the main stipulations. There's nothing that Abraham really has to do. In fact, it's all on God. And God shows that by in this vision where the animals are cut, and he walks through the pot and the torch go through these cut animals. Okay, so this whole ceremony is showing us a covenant of grant. Now, attached to that is the part that covers, if we can use that language, that covers the suzerain, the great king. And this is the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. And so what happens is Israel is in the land of their enemies. They come in through the water. They are baptized in the Red Sea. They come up on the other side, okay? And now the covenant is given to them. Now, wait, I thought that I've been talking about Deuteronomy as the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. This is true. I have been talking about Deuteronomy as the Suzerain Vassal Treaty, but it is argued by Meredith Kline that Exodus, the Ten Commandments, is a covenant in and of itself, and that the book of Deuteronomy is the covenant ratification. I actually, I agree with this to an extent. I actually find it to be maybe a little bit more in depth than that. I think that there is a structure to the Ten Commandments, and I think that we see that structure within the book of Deuteronomy. So ultimately, I think that the book, or that the Ten Commandments is a covenant, but I think it is the chapter headings. And I didn't come up with this, by the way. This is not something out of my own brain. This I've been blessed to learn from people like Michael Gonzalez and others who have informed me of this teaching, and then I've gone and studied it. You can find it in Outlines of the Bible. Outlines of Bible Books by David Lang, Greg Ward, and Sean Nelson. And this is basically what they say: is that there is the Ten Commandments are chapter headings, and that we see this represented within the book of Deuteronomy. So let's go through this real quick. The first commandment, have no other gods. This is a chapter heading, and then is expanded from Deuteronomy 6:1 through 11:32. Okay? The second commandment, avoid idolatry. This is expanded in 12:1 through 32. The third commandment, avoid blasphemy, 13:1 through 14:21 in Deuteronomy. Again, this is all Deuteronomy, by the way. The fourth commandment, keep the Sabbath, is expanded in 14:22, Deuteronomy 14:22 through 16:17. The fifth commandment, human authority, is covered in 16:18, and obviously honor your father and mother. This is expanded into human authority in general, and we see this: judges, courts of law, kings, priests, Levites, and true and false prophets. This is from 16:18 through 18:22. The sixth commandment, murder, is covered in 19:1 through 21:23, and there's all sorts of, if you read through this, there's all sorts of different commands if someone is murdered, right? Or death in war and things like that. Basically killing, it's not necessarily murder, but expanded into what happens if kind of killing, right? The seventh command, adultery, is seen in 22:1 through 23:14. Things like belonging together and things not belonging, marriage violations, purity in the assembly and the camp, things like this. The eighth commandment, stealing, is covered in 23:15 through 24:7. The ninth commandment, honesty and trust, 24:8 through 16. And the 10th commandment, covetousness, is 24:17 through 26:15. Okay, so I can list all that for you if you want me to. Maybe I'll list it in on the actual post on Pronomian where this video will reside. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can go and check it out there. Okay, so why do I go through all that? I find it super interesting to me. It is super interesting, I should say, that the Ten Commandments are seen this way and then expanded out. Now, this isn't necessarily. I mean, we can't say this is 100% what's going on, but it makes a whole lot of sense to me, and I think that there is some validity to it. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through just a little bit of what a suzerain vassal treaty is. And we've already looked at what a suzerain vassal treaty is, but we're going to see how it aligns. So within a traditional suzerain vassal treaty, what we have is we have a preamble, a historical prologue, stipulations, curses and blessings or covenant ratifications, and then succession arrangements or covenant continuity. Okay, and do we see this in Scripture, in Deuteronomy? So remember that Israel comes up out of the water, they go to Sinai, they get these 10 words. There's a whole thing in Meredith Klein's book on the fact that there was 2 tablets that were usually made for suzerain vassal treaties. One was resided with the great king, wherever he was, and then one resided with the vassal, wherever he was. So there was two copies of this same covenant. One was with one king and one was with the vassal. And we see when Moses goes up to Sinai, he gets 2 tablets. And a lot of people, we have in our mind, we have this idea of like Moses coming down, right? The 10 Commandments, right? Like the movie, The 10 Commandments. Moses comes down, he's got these 2 giant, stones that he's carrying down. And one of them has 5 commandments and one of them has 5 commandments. And this is the 10 Commandments. If the 10 Commandments are in fact a covenant and are would be seen as the same as the suzerain vassal treaties of the 1400s BCE, then actually the 2 stone tablets would have they would be mirrored. It would be one for Israel and one for God. And remember that they were supposed to be in the Ark of the Covenant, right? Well, where was the Ark of the Covenant? It was with the people, but it was also the footstool of God. So I think you see where we're going here. Okay, so let's get your piece of paper and pen ready, because this is where you're going to see the suzerain vassal treaties align with Deuteronomy. We see the preamble in 1 through 5. What is the preamble? The preamble would be like who the great king is. And this was to announce basically who the great king was and why he should be listened to. The historical prologue essentially did the same thing and would kind of go through the history of why this king was now making this covenant with this people. In the preamble, and actually I'll read from Klein here. This is interesting. He says, got to get my glasses on. I apologize. Hang on. See if I can actually see this. He says, okay, I am the Lord thy God. The opening words of the Sinaitic proclamation, Exodus 20, verse 2a, corresponds to the preamble of the suzerainty treaties, which identifies the suzerain, or great king, and that in terms of calculated to inspire awe and fear. For example, the treaty of, and I'm going to get all these names wrong, so I apologize for that, but they'll sound somewhat right. For example, the treaty of Merciless with his vassal Tesub of Amaru begins, quote, these are the words of the son Merciless, the great king, the king of the haughty land, the valiant, the favorite of the storm god, the son of Sipululiamus, etc. Such treaties continued in an I-thou style with an historical prologue surveying the great king's previous relations with and especially his benefactions to the vassal king. In the treaty just referred to, Merciless reminds Dupi Tesub of the vassal status of his father and grandfather, their loyalty and enjoyment of Merciless, just oversight, and climactically there is narrated how Merciless, true to his promise to Dupi Tesub's father, secured the dynastic succession for Dupi Tesub, sick and ailing though he was. In the Decalogue, the historical prologue is found in the further words of the Lord, quote, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, Exodus 22. So what what Klein is doing at this point is he's showing how we have the first covenant, which is, when I say first covenant, what I mean is the Ten Commandments, the covenant that is made with Israel before they get to the land. Now, we got to remember this too. Remember that the covenant is cut with Israel at Sinai, but then when God brings them to the land, which was promised to Abraham. So these two covenants are working in complete tandem. They can't be separated. One is the promise to Abraham that that his dynasty will be established and attached to a land. Once the people get to the land, there's this new covenant that's supposed to be cut. But what happens? The people get to the land and they reject it. They say, we don't want it. Remember, they send the spies in. All the spies come back and say, no, let's not go up, except for Joshua and Caleb, who bring the good report. And then Israel says, no, we don't want it. We're going to go with the spies the good spies, right? And God says, all right, fine, you don't want my covenant? Not a problem. And then they wander for 40 years. That generation dies out. Then what happens? They come back. Deuteronomy is by that time cut. This is the ratification of the first covenant. Now he offers that covenant to them again. And the next generation says, yes, we will accept this. And then he brings them over. And so once again, these two covenants have to work in tandem. You can't have the Abrahamic covenant without the Mosaic covenant. You can't have the Mosaic covenant without the Abrahamic covenant. However, the Mosaic covenant and the covenant of Deuteronomy, which is the entire Mosaic covenant, that is found in Deuteronomy. So we see the beginning of it. We see what I like to think of as the chapter headings of the covenant at Sinai. But then we see the full picture of that covenant being cut in Deuteronomy. And ultimately when Joshua is about to go into the land, right? Okay. Let's go back. So he's talking about Exodus at this point. There are many interesting parallels to specific biblical requirements among the treaty stipulations, but to mention only the most prominent, the fundamental demand is always for through commitment to the suzerain to the exclusion of alien alliances. Thus, Marcellus insists, but you, Dupi Tasub, remain loyal towards the king of the Hatti land and Hatti land, my sons and my grandsons forever. Do not turn your eyes to anyone else. And Yahweh commands his servant, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Exodus 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So I think that this is extremely important for us to understand. Let's go through this. The preamble is found in this. Now we're looking at Deuteronomy, not Exodus now. The preamble is found in Deuteronomy 1 through 5. The historical prologue is found in 1, 6 through 449. I would encourage you to read these with this portion of a suzerain vassal treaty in mind while you're reading them, because it really does align very well. The stipulations are found in Deuteronomy chapter 5 through 26. So we have this huge chunk of the stipulations. What are those stipulations? If you do this, I will bless you with this. If you don't do this, I will not bless you, or I will curse you, or whatever it may be. And if you go look at some of the suzerain vassal treaties of the 1400s, this is exactly what happens. Curses and blessings or covenant ratifications are found in Deuteronomy 27 through 30. Secession arrangements or covenant continuity is found in 31 through 34, in which are included the invocation of witnesses. Remember in Deuteronomy that God calls the witnesses of the heavens and the earth to witness the cutting of this covenant. And also found in 31 through 34, the directions for the disposition of public reading of the treaty. And we see this as well in Deuteronomy. Okay, so all of this is really important. And why is it so important? I think that maybe at some point we might kind of start to miss why all of this is important. I mean, you might think to yourself, okay, we've gone over a lot of this stuff. It really doesn't mean anything to me. Why should I care about any of this? Well, you should care about this for multiple reasons. Number one, it's scripture, so we should care about it because we're in covenant relationship with God, and this is the covenant that was cut with Israel, right? If you're a Christian who doesn't believe that you're part of Israel, then we're going to be talking about that. Ultimately, next week, what we're going to talk about is dispensationalism. What we start to see is we see that, and this happens long beforehand, but we see almost, within a very quick time, from the time that Christ dies, rises, and ascends, we see a separation of church trying to get away from Israel. It's not instantaneous, but there's this pull of we're different than them. And this naturally comes because Israel as a whole rejects Christ as the Christ, right? They reject Jesus as the Christ. Whereas the church, who starts out 100%, for the most part, 100% Jewish, but then starts to get Gentiles coming in as well, they want to see themselves different or separate from those who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So there's this natural break, but we'll see, especially in like our look at dispensationalism, there is this need to try to figure out how exactly God is dealing with the church today. And the reason why is because it certainly seems that the covenants that are cut with Abraham, the covenants that are cut with Israel, are not only dynastic, but they're forever. God says that they're forever. And so then the question is, well, has God forsaken his covenant? Has God or has he broken his covenant? Something that he can't do, right? God can't break the covenant because he is perfect. He is the Almighty. And so some people might say, well, we broke the covenant, so he's out. There's a false teaching going around that says that the covenant, that God divorced Israel, and the only way that a person can remarry a divorced person is if there's a death, and so God had to die so that he could remarry Israel. This is totally false, and honestly, I think it's nonsense for a multitude of reasons. I've spoken on this in a multitude of times, actually. And if that's something that you believe, stick around. We'll try to talk about that as well. Ultimately, the reason that these covenants are so important, I believe, is because, and I think that the name of this channel, the name of this website should be a tipping point, a tipping of the hat, a showing of the cards. I believe that the covenant that is cut with Israel is made for Christians as well, because through our covenant inclusion, through Christ, we have become covenant members, meaning we have joined the covenant family of God. And therefore, the covenant stipulations, the covenant curses, everything, all these covenant stipulations, everything applies to us. This is not a bad thing, by the way. In fact, this is a good thing. Block says in his book, the keeping of the covenant stipulations were not seen as burdensome in any way. I'm paraphrasing. I bet I could find it in a few seconds. Maybe I'll read it next time. He says they were not seen as burdensome in any way, but rather a blessing. And the reason why was because we all of a sudden got the benefits of being in a covenant relationship with the Almighty God. In fact, the covenant stipulations were seen as a total blessing. And so I think that this is how we need to view the covenant. This was not a bad thing for Israel. Getting these covenant stipulations, it's not like they said to themselves, oh man, I like God and all, but I really wish that we could spend money or, do our work on the Sabbath, or, I really like my bacon. So these, I don't know if I really want this covenant. This is not at all what was happening. In fact, I think that kind of mentality is not only wrong, but I think it's kind of it just comes from a misunderstanding of what the covenant and the covenant stipulations are. Okay, so I hope that this has enlightened us a little bit, shed some light on the Mosaic covenant as a suzerain vassal treaty. What this does for me is this shows once again there is a temporal aspect to God's covenants. It is a mirror of something greater. We're going to talk about that in not next week, but the week after, when we look at the new covenant and what is so different about the new covenant, and how long has the new covenant been around? And what does Christ mean when he says, this is the blood of the covenant? This is my blood of the new covenant. I'm paraphrasing. I need to have it in front of me. Anyway, the point is that all of this ties into what we're studying right now. All of this ties into the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. It all ties into the Covenant of Grant. So far, let's just timeline it real quick. We've looked at the first, what we're calling as a covenant, the Covenant of Works, which was with Adam, which is the idea of, and we've skipped over like the Noahic covenant, but we've looked at the Covenant of Works, which is God is in personal covenant relationship with Adam, and there's stipulations to this covenant. If you do this thing, you will no longer be in covenant relationship with me. If you don't do these things, then you will be in covenant relationship with me, right? He does the thing he's not supposed to do. He is exiled out of his land, out of the land that he was communing with God in, and now he's on the outside. He's no longer in covenant relationship with God. Now we can talk about whether or not he had the ability to come back into covenant relationship with God. I believe he does. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks. Not the point. Later, we see a temporal picture of the covenant for our temporal place and for the space that we're in that helps us in this place not only show a picture of, but it also is a covenant for earth, God's people on earth, and it has stipulations, it has blessings, it has curses. First, we see the covenant of grant, promising that the Messiah would come through this dynastic line that would be given lands. God brings the people to this land and makes the covenant that pertains to that land and to the earth and to the people. And then we're going to get into other covenants after that. But next week, I think we're going to talk about dispensationalism. Okay, if you have questions, please send them to me. info@pronomian.com is probably the best email address for me. And yeah, if you have questions, please, by all means, I would love to hear your questions. If there's things I'm missing, if I'm going too fast, if I'm kind of over everybody's head, just let me know. I would love to maybe even roll it back a little bit and go over things that people need me to again, or whatever it may be. I'm going to give you this book again. This is a short, nice little book. It explains so much about Suzerain Vassal Treaties. Treaty of the Great King by Meredith Kline. He's passed away now, but the book is dynamite, and I think it's well needed I think every Christian should study it, or at least read it once. All right, thanks so much. Have a great time, and I will see you next week.